Marina, I suppose one of the things that we're having this conversation about is what's wrong with higher education as we've experienced it, and what needs to be done, particularly in the kind of world we're in at the moment. And you've had some pungent things to say about what's wrong about higher education, and I've got a bit involved in that debate too. So maybe we should start with trying to identify some of those things that have made the higher education world so unfriendly in some ways to the life of the mind in recent years.
I'm afraid that I have got increasingly pessimistic, although I saw a wonderful quote the other day from Cornel West in which he says, "I am a pessimist, but I am a prisoner of hope." And I think that while I'm a pessimist, I'm also a prisoner of hope. So I salute this new school of the Anthropocene because it's an expression of hope.
Yes.
But I also feel extremely dark and depressed because there's numerous assaults on what we think of as whole education, holistic education. There's been a lot of cuts. There's been a lot of decreased funding to the larger, broader spectrum of education rather than to the skills. And there's a lot of talk about vocational training, as if somehow it wasn't vocational training before when people were being educated more broadly. And the commercial neoliberal model is clearly not a good economic model. I mean, it's failing on its own terms, which is why we're getting all these cuts. So I'm standing on a position of despair, but nevertheless resistance.
It's a very paradoxical situation, isn't it, that at the very moment when there's something of a rising tide of criticism of the neoliberal consensus, that the educational establishment should be clinging more desperately, as it were, to that particular rock in the ocean, because the dysfunctionality of the model we're in terms of social delivery, in terms of the viability of our environment and so forth, has never been more apparent. And yet it seems as if that's what's driving us. And to me, the most conspicuously barbaric bit of the agenda is the idea that you should somehow be assessing the success of educational processes by the income that graduates will earn. When you see that being enshrined more and more, that seems to me to be a kind of insult, in a way, to the huge variety of human and humane openings and careers that people with a good education actually take up in the world.
Yes, also it's short-termism because it doesn't take into account the extraordinary importance of long-term developments. I mean, how ideas and values build over time, not only in individuals as they grow older, but in the whole society as it evolves. And I always like the story, the sort of fact that the GNP of New Zealand was entirely transformed by the Lord of the Rings, and it then became, since then, the head of CGI in the world. And this has really made a major difference to it. But who could have ever predicted the Anglo-Saxon studies, as so cultivated at Oxford by rather eccentric teachers of English, should have led to this worldwide industry, which is, the Shire, the Hobbits, and the Lord of the Rings. So, and this seems to me a very, not an exception, actually, a paradigmatic example of how you cannot predict economic outcomes. But what you do need is imagination and people filled with vocational desires that they enjoy fulfilling.
I was part of a discussion not so very long ago, which was trying to tease out different kinds of intelligence in terms of whether you are exercising your intelligence in order to find better questions to ask, or in order to settle and seal the questions you started with. And it seems to me that that's a very fundamental principle here in any education, any humanistic education worth the name, that you're looking for better questions, which is also to say, picking up, I think, something you were hinting at, that a proper humanistic education is one in which you learn about learning. You learn how you have learned individually and corporately, and you learn about how you continue to learn.
Well, a lot of the sort of pedagogical visionaries who inform the resistance to the current model, actually believed that you shouldn't start with knowledge. You should start with inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had someone like Friedrich Froebel,
yes.
you just believed that was a great figure, the creator of kindergartens, the founder of kindergartens. And he was primarily interested in primary school, just smaller children. But his ideas can be applied across the board. And he wanted children to discover things. He wanted to put tools into their hands that they could unfold. I mean, sticks and stones and colors, and then move along, opening their minds and then planting these gardens to see how the garden grew, rather than teaching them botany or agriculture from a book in which they simply imbibe the knowledge. And of course, it's expensive in a way because it's time-consuming, that kind of heuristic approach. But it's based in play and the human genius for improvisation and invention and play. And that's being stifled, very seriously stifled, by just spoon-feeding all the time. Students keep wanting to be told, exactly what they should think, which is, they've been trained from, childhood that there is a right answer and they should learn it by heart and then regurgitate it in exams.
Yes, and the prevalence in some circles of multiple choice style examinations where you circle one of several options and that's the correct answer. I found that very depressing to see in for example, GCSE work in English or languages with my own children.
But I also think it's very dangerous, actually, because all the alternatives that are incorrect, the brain is very malleable and it absorbs what it sees. I think I would have got very, very confused if I'd been given multiple choice questionnaires, because reading all these alternatives, they would have registered. I think it's using incorrect language and feeding incorrect ideas. Perhaps one shouldn't have an idea of a correctness, but it's just a very dangerous road to go down.
I don't know if you know the work that Phil Davis of Liverpool has done recently on Shakespeare's language. Because that's very telling, isn't it? He notes, as many people have noted, how much Shakespeare coins words and uses technically very incorrect and very eccentric forms. He turns nouns into verbs. He childed as I fathered, that kind of phrase.
Actually, I was nodding because I don't know Phil Davis's work on Shakespeare, but I know his work with prisoners.
Absolutely, yes. And it dovetails with
reading that. And that's very impressive, and very much the kind of opening of the idea of opening onto horizons through culture, through not seeing it as elite or inaccessible, but as a form of play that actually develops one's thinking and opens horizons.
That's right, and of course, alongside that, again, some of the stuff that Phil Davis has done, alongside that, we now can map some of the neurological ways in which the unexpected grammatical turn in a sentence or a poem or something like that will in fact literally open new paths in the brain, so that the notion that you can actually think beyond what you're being fed, which seems to be the heart of all this, that is one of the advantages of that resistance to the multiple choice.
One of the things that I've been very concerned with for quite a while is, it's a very obvious question, but what the relationship is between imaginative stories and possibilities. And on the whole, imaginative stories have rather lost their status in the sense that they're now associated with fake news, and there's a sort of a growing anxiety around works of imagination, and we've seen, for example, a tremendous tendency now to memoir and to autofiction, as it's called, because at least the narrator is there and we identify the narrator, whereas the fiction is such a huge area of invention. I'm very distressed by this. I think that invention is a very important part of actually growing a better world.
It's an absolutely key point, isn't it? I've just been sent a a copy of Alan Garner's new book.
Yes, yes.
And he's somebody for whom I have the greatest possible affection and admiration, as an absolutely unashamed fabulist, somebody who will invite you to think your way and feel your way very, very deeply into what the human situation is by an extraordinary penetration into place and time and, yes, to magic and fantasy, not in a self-indulgent way, but in an extremely demanding imaginative exercise. Now that's
with wonderful language.
With wonderful language.
Extraordinary use of, and with lots of local Cheshire. Is it got lots of local Cheshire in it?
It's a local kind of story, yes. And it's that kind of deliberate exuberance, deliberate unleashing of language, which I think distinguishes it from the world of fake news, from making things up with an agenda of persuasion or control. And I think that's the key difference. The lies of political propaganda and journalistic fiction these days, and I don't apologize for using the word lies, these are lies which have the purpose of controlling, shutting down possibilities. Fiction doesn't shut down possibilities, but opens them up. And if you don't open them up in fiction, you don't open them up in politics either, I think.
Yes, that's right. And also, of course, there's a sort of use of terror in fake news, frightening people with imagined disasters. But actually, that brings me on to a point I thought I might make about the current problems of climate change and how it's so difficult to get movement on it. And I think there is here possibly a relationship with how we tell stories. And so I'd offer these two thoughts. I don't know, because it's very much I'd like to hear what you have to say, Rowan. But first, that there tends to be a sort of frightening story of apocalypse. Mm-hmm. And I think that story suffers from people not following it because they know it in other fictional forms where they have not had to act. Mm. So it's a kind of slightly discredited form in a way.
Yeah.
And then the other form of narrative that dominates climate change is, of course, the kind of elegy, the ubi sunt, where are they all now, where are the snows of yesteryear, the idea that we lament over the fall of Nineveh, the fall of Babylon, the fall of Jerusalem, and so forth, and there's sort of nothing to be done. So that's fatalist. And I think, therefore, to my mind, this is connected to play and to invention of stories, because we need new stories that are more particular, more like Alan Garner, closer to people's lived experience.
Yes, that's a very interesting take on it, I think. But the kind of stasis, the paralysis of action around climate change has something to do with the fact that we haven't got almost the literary style, the literary genre in which to describe it. And I think you're right about apocalypse. The bizarre thing is that, yes, apocalypse is a familiar idiom. We sort of know about stories about the end of the world, and we can give a pleasurable shudder and pass on. But that doesn't tell us at all what is possible for us. And what we're talking about here, I think, in terms of the life of the imagination, is fictions that make something possible. Now, both elegy and apocalypse, in that sense, don't make anything new possible. And strangely enough, the Alan Garner style, if you like, the inhabiting of a very particular world which is both deeply familiar and strange, which has deep roots in time and solid presence in space, inhabiting that and finding energy within that. I agree. I think that is much more converting, to use the good British phrase, than the language of apocalypse in many ways.
I think that Robert Macfarlane, who I think is actually associated with your new school of the Anthropocene, I think his Lost Words idea was a very good idea. It's quite local, it's quite small, though it's very deep and wide and has many repercussions. But it also focuses on the loss, on the actual loss, and it's not a kind of apocalyptic visionary shudder across multitudes and worlds, but it's a kind of local thing that people have forgotten the name for, spindrift, or for Love Lies Bleeding.
That's right, and that we have children's dictionaries from which the word blackbird is absent. That kind of thing. Yes, and I think alongside that goes what I think is a good, if perhaps slightly overworked, style in contemporary writing, which is the new nature writing, where specific stories of engagement with the natural world are presented. Helen Macdonald's wonderful work,
Yes.
and also Peter Wohlleben on The Secret Life of Trees. These stories of very, very physical, very again, very localized and very incarnate engagements. I think they do help. I think it's perhaps in danger of becoming yet another fad, but at best, this is wonderful writing that does, I suppose, renew for a lot of people the sense that learning is a physical matter, not just a matter of decanting stuff from one container to another. And intelligence is a physical affair.
Yes, and it's thoroughly empirical, and it's embodied, and it's phenomenological. Actually, there was a good example, which is James Attlee's book Under the Rainbow. Did you see that? That was about the NHS thanking the NHS sign. People began putting in their windows spontaneously.
Yes.
He was curious in Oxford, where he lives, as to why people were doing it and how they came about doing it. And he bicycled around and talked to people on their doorsteps. And the interesting thing about it was the very great range of responses, but also the community that he built up when everybody was shut down by simply doing this. And so that, again, this community, which is a little bit an overworked word, but the present educational systems are with their emphasis on competition, on the excellence and the individual in competition with everyone else. That actually doesn't help create bonds in the way that cooperative play can do.
No, indeed, because cooperative play is about the creation of common culture through common symbol. If you're playing together, there are symbolic parameters that you're working within. There are signs that you recognize in one another. And quite often it seems to me as if the only signs we can recognize in one another are the very minimal signals that have to do with the competitive and acquisitive world, the symbolic world of advertising, and of course ultimately the symbolic world of capital. And the signs that actually allow us to recognize shared aspiration, shared commitment, and yes, shared imagination, if you like, those are the signs that need building up, and that I think again a robust educational system should be committed to from the very first, which is why the Froebels and others are so very, and the Montessoris are so very important as part of the sense of what the educational project really is about.
Yes, I mean, I always am astonished that while advertising, in a sense, rules the world and certainly sustains all our social media now, it's the hidden funding behind all the systems we now use.
Yes.
Even while this is happening, people don't understand how valuable and powerful language is. Advertising is based on that, with plus images and sound, but nevertheless mostly a message, mostly verbal. And yet we so many of us retreat from actually using language to persuade towards a different style. I mean, maybe we don't have enough, the best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity, and we're very frightened of that. I mean, I'm frightened of that, having my opinions and peddling my opinions, but at the same time, I now feel more and more that if we don't actually put up a bulwark of fair speech, I call it fair speech, against foul speech.
Yes.
Fair speech. We will fail. The world will go on the way it's going.
Yes, and that implies, I think, doesn't it, that foul speech is again speech which is simply manipulated or deployed in someone's interest. That's how advertising works. To understand both how words have power and how they mustn't be allowed to have unbridled power or secret power, occult power, that's part of the task of what you might call a democratic imagination, a real shared imaginative project, in which, rather than simply defending the abstract value of free speech, which has become a bit of a dialogue of the deaf at the moment, we might well talk about fair speech, about speech which is just, which is which is capable of being challenged and being explored intelligently, rationally, in the proper meaning of the word rational. And there again, we have an issue, don't we, in that rationality has been conscripted by certain parties in this discussion.
Yes, yes. And it's very difficult because one doesn't want to, I mean, on the freedom of speech issue, in terms of literature, it's very tricky because one wants to have the freedom of the imagination for writers. But at the same time, one doesn't want it to be too policed too closely, and that puts one in the wrong camp. I mean, the camp of, it can put one into the sort of people defending racism, which is a real problem.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And again, the paradox is that some of the ideologies which fight under the flag of free speech are in fact so deeply reductive of the human project that we're involved with, so deeply particularist and competitive and violent. And that's one of the tangles that we really have to deal with at the moment, and nobody's dealing with it terribly well as far as I can see.
No, it's very difficult. I did read a book which I did like very much, actually. Sarah Schulman, Conflict is Not Abuse.
Oh, yes, yes.
It was recommended to me by a colleague at Birkbeck. And she makes a very good distinction between dissenting and having disagreements, even having real standoffs with a friend, and abuse.
Yes.
And she says that there's too much of, she's a kind of philosopher, American philosopher. And she says there's too quick a leap to the accusation of abuse.
Yeah.
We have to understand we're complicated, diverse people, and we have different ideas, and we should discuss them.
Yes.
Again, it takes time. I mean, it's rather like the education as play and inquiry. It takes time because you have to be patient and hear people out.
Yes.
Whereas social media is an accelerated, tinderbox that just rushes at things.
On this question of taking time, I think that's part of what I was hinting at with the idea that education is learning about learning. How did we get to think this way is always a question worth asking, I think, in any debate. And it's one of the things which I believe can stop us assuming that disagreement is, if you like, a total moral standoff, that the other person, if they think otherwise from myself, is not only wrong but wicked. And that's the default setting in a lot of debate these days. If you think that, you must be bad. We have no moral ground in common. But if you begin to say, well, how did I come to see this? How did you come to that conclusion? Let's look at those narratives side by side, not in a relativistic way or saying, well, I might be wrong, you might be right, but just how it happens that we came to this conclusion. What sort of things did we think was evidence? What reasons did we apply? What reasoning did we think was valid? Then at least you are opening up some time together, some possibility of exchange. And I think that's all being swept away in the idiom exchange.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very deep in the structures of what we think of as, democracy, unfortunately. I mean, the House of Commons, this morning I was listening to the debate, to the budget, and they said, well, they're not waving their papers on the other side of the House. And this idea of confronting across a chasm,
yes,
you're definitely locked in your binary system, and that's been replicated in there are proportional representational democracies where a different kind of stasis occurs. But I think it would be better to have more proportional representation and less of this confrontation and the idea of there's always an opposition and one is defeated and the other is not. And whereas if we could, more of a kind of negotiated, not a compromise, but a negotiated arrival at knowledge, arrival at wisdom, arrival at judgment.
Yes, arrival at a point where you can together cope with a situation and recognize that coping with the situation is the task you have to pursue together. I wonder, though, and you've mentioned the House of Commons, I wonder what difference it does make in legislatures that don't have the same kind of architecture, because we're back to symbols here, aren't we?
Yes.
I think you're right that the oppositional symbolism of Westminster is very, very powerful and very troubling. The Assembly in Cardiff has a rather different kind of architecture with a kind of convergent semicircular pattern. And whether or not that affects the slightly more coalition-inclined politics of Wales, I wouldn't like to say, but I think it is a factor here.
Yes, well, people have, haven't they? I mean, the UN is kind of circular.
That's right. Yes.
So I think it does make a difference.
People have recognised that how we build does reflect what we think matters and how we think knowledge works. And I think when we look around at our architecture, we can learn something about what we take for granted in the human world, and it's not very encouraging at present. The triumph, if you like, of trophy architecture over genuinely functional and therefore genuinely rational architecture. But that's another story.
Yes. No, that is, and also there's a sort of, your trophy you're saying, but also display.
Yes, exactly. Yes, this exists in order to promote rather than to serve.
I was very struck that I reviewed the Pope's last book. I don't know if you reviewed it, Rowan. Did you?
I didn't, but I know the book you mean.
Yeah, yes. And I was very struck that apparently when he has seminars in the Vatican on contentious issues, he asks the speakers to keep silent for a while. I can't remember the exact duration after each one has spoken, so that they don't lash back at each other. They don't leap to attack, but they have a sort of moment of reflection. And yes. I don't know if it works, but it seems to me that there should be on social media a definite, do you really mean to send this, or perhaps think about this till the morning?
I have sometimes argued that we ought to have a tomorrow morning button somewhere on computers.
I think you're right. I think the tomorrow morning button should be the default setting.
Absolutely.
I have one thing I think I'd quite like to say, and that is that one of the recent decisions that this government made, it seems to me to be incomprehensible in their own terms, according to their own desires and principles, which is cutting the arts budget to schools. I do think that considering the cultural industries are a vast source of prestige in the world, as well as actual hard currency, and how we have actually managed to produce, largely through the investment in the post-war period, the investment in such things, these giants, like David Hockney, who are internet, as well as rock stars. I don't follow rock music, but the art schools, music and school, and so forth, have produced just waves of talent, which actually did fructify for the country. It's not my interest at all whether they're wealth producing. I'm interested in people being fulfilled. But nevertheless, they were wealth producing. And I simply cannot fathom the rationale for these cuts, because they're not actually very valuable. There's not huge amounts of money, but they're extremely significant for the schools involved. They mean that there will be no music teacher, there will be no arts teacher.
Yes, I think you're right in saying that part of the rationale, if you can call it that, for these cuts is cosmetic. It appeals to a public which simply doesn't know about the soft power of the arts, which doesn't know about what you've just said about the creative industries. And it's a bit like the cuts made to international aid. Again, it plays to an audience that wants a soft target and doesn't think in terms of how a country's standing and, in the best and fullest sense, prosperity depends to some extent on the values it exemplifies and the priorities it puts out in the public sphere. So that, in fact, these minuscule savings, and they're minuscule in both these areas, both in arts funding and in international aid, these minuscule savings are promoted simply to reinforce what, as we said at the beginning, is in fact a failing model of prosperity, wealth creation, and international relations, a failing model of an uncriticized market.
And also, it doesn't take into account these recent months of the pandemic, where we've got a terrible rise in mental distress, understandably, and amongst young people, because of they're being enclosed and not having a natural growing up with friends and so forth, and cooped up in their house. And and their learning falling away. And there were some very successful artists' initiatives during the pandemic. In fact, First Sight in Colchester won the Museum of the Year because they created the most wonderful activity packs, which actually I downloaded and used, full of fun and ideas of how you could live in your own home, even if it was very small and cramped, and actually do do things that expressed yourself. And that side of the world of the arts in education is really crucial. It's really important.
Absolutely crucial.
A way of people feeling happier, to sing a song together. I mean, it sounds sort of banal, but it isn't.
It's I think, genuinely a matter of life and death.